Turkey is a land of contrasts. Its unique position, straddling both Asia and Europe, has long made it a bridge between East and West. Its population is almost entirely Muslim, and yet for more than 80 years, Turks have been governed by strictly secular principles. Principles introduced by the founding father of the Republic, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk.
He is the cement of the Turkish nation that holds it together. Atatürk provided the Turks with hope in a time of despair. He gave us our independence.
As parliamentary elections approach, Atatürk's shadow looms larger than ever in modern Turkey. For some, he is a proud national icon, but for others, Atatürk is the symbol of a state that is using his memory for its own oppressive purposes.
I tend to think that the cult of Atatürk, as it has survived in this country since the 1930s, is primarily a cult of the state. It is a cult of a certain regime that wants to stay in power.
In recent months, millions of Turks have taken to the streets to protest against the policies of the ruling AK, or Justice and Development Party. The protesters accuse the AK party of attempting to Islamize the country in defiance of modern Turkey's secular traditions. Secularism is at the heart of the political debate in Turkey, and it is represented by one man, Atatürk, a man it is illegal to criticize. I traveled to Turkey to explore the extraordinary and contested legacy of Atatürk, the father of the Turks. Born in 1881, Mustafa Kemal graduated from the military academy in 1905, beginning what would be a highly distinguished career as a soldier. The Ottoman Empire Atatürk grew up in had endured since 1299, yet by the early 20th century it was in decline, unable to match the military or economic strength of the industrialized powers such as Britain and France. More and more Ottoman territory was being progressively lost. It had rightly become known as the sick man of Europe. Ahead of the First World War, the Sultan, Mehmed V, made a fateful decision which would lead to the breakup of one of the world's last great empires. He sided with Germany against the Allies. Mustafa Kemal was to see the horrors of the Great War at first hand. As a division commander, he fought against the Allies in the infamous Gallipoli campaign of 1915. Atatürk's commanding presence on the battlefield helped to check the Allied push. Atatürk had climbed his first step to fame, and he had done so with the help of the military, a force he would harness again in years to come. But after 3 years of fighting, the Ottoman war machine collapsed, and the Allies began to divide the empire among themselves. Istanbul had been the imperial capital of the Ottoman Empire for centuries. From here, the Sultan ruled over a vast empire that controlled large parts of 3 continents. But when Atatürk returned here after World War I, he found the city occupied by Allied forces. He was determined to restore Turkish sovereignty. Atatürk left Istanbul for Anatolia, the heartland of central Turkey, to organize a national resistance movement. He soon came to view the Sultan's imperial government based in Istanbul as little more than the agent of foreign powers. Like-minded people gathered around him to establish an effective resistance to the Allies and a rival government to that in Istanbul. It was in this building in Ankara that the first session of the Grand National Assembly of Turkey gathered on April the 23rd, 1920. Atatürk was its president. Later that year, the Ottomans, still the official rulers, signed the Treaty of Sèvres, dividing up the empire, including much of Turkey itself, among the Europeans.
Right then, the European powers were trying to divide Turkey up into little areas of influence, and where Britain, France, even Italy was going to take bits of it.
Atatürk could not accept this decision of the imperial government. It would have spelled the end of Turkish independence. He decided to take on the Sultan and the invaders.
Atatürk went to Anatolia to fight a war of resistance against these plans by the European allies.
By August 1922, the Turks were victorious in their war of independence. Atatürk's successes against the invaders gave him and what was still a rival government increasing legitimacy in the eyes of the people. In November that year, Atatürk's assembly succeeded in stripping Sultan Mehmed VI of his powers. The Dolmabahce Palace, formerly a symbol of his power, now became his prison. On October the 29th, 1923, the Republic of Turkey was declared, with Mustafa Kemal, the hero of the War of Independence, as its president, and his power base here in Ankara as its capital. His dream had been achieved. He now set about shaping a new state in his image, one that looked west for its inspiration. Under the Ottomans, the Sultan's legitimacy as ruler rested on his position as Caliph, God's representative on earth. The authority of the state came from Islam. Atatürk abolished the position of Caliph, and the last Caliph was expelled on March the 3rd, 1924. He left the Dolmabahce Palace from this gate, never to return. This was a radical break with the past. When Atatürk came to power, he instituted new sweeping measures aimed at distancing the new state from its Ottoman past. He abolished not only the Sultanate, but the Caliphate as well. Religious schools and courts were closed down, and religious leaders stripped of their authority. Atatürk wanted his people's principles and loyalties to lie solely with him and not with Islam.
Yapmış olduğu reformlar
Atatürk's religious reforms were symbolic reforms, aimed at changing the culture of the society. Measures such as the change in clothing, the banning of the fez, and the scripture reform were symbolic.
They may have been symbolic, but the secular measures Atatürk's government passed here did not go unnoticed. But any opposition he encountered was soon quashed.
There were other small Islamic uprisings against him because he was very determined that Turkey should get to be the equal of the West. He'd lived through the decline and fall of the Ottoman Empire, and he was determined that wouldn't happen to him. And his analysis was that it would be best for Turkey to imitate the best practices of Europe at the time, which basically was equivalent of civilization.
One of Atatürk's most radical measures was the changing of the alphabet. The Arabic script was abandoned in favor of an adapted Latin alphabet. Turkish was to be a Western language. Overnight, educated people found themselves illiterate. This statue shows Atatürk teaching children the new script, a reform that was particularly controversial in the Islamic world. Traditionalists resented the fact that Turks would no longer be able to read the Arabic script, the language in which the word of God had been revealed to the Prophet Muhammad in the Holy Quran.
Turkish society was a society of peasants whose lives revolved around traditional and religious practices. How can rural peasants internalize a bourgeois notion like secularism? It had to be imposed on them. And that was only possible by using an oppressive system of government. The military-civil coalition took on this task and imposed their will on the majority.
The Republic was established in a country which was probably the world's most homogeneously Muslim country in the early 1920s. For that reason, I think the goal for a real and serious secularism in this country was already doomed by the time the Republic was established. You can't get any secularism in any serious and real meaning in a country whose population is almost entirely and homogeneously Muslim.
Mustafa Kemal was given the title Atatürk, or Father of the Turks, in 1934, a tribute to his stature. Although he married, he never actually fathered any children. Instead, he adopted several, the youngest of whom, Ülkü Adatepe, is one of the few people now alive to remember the great man. She accompanied me to the Dolmabahce Palace, which, in spite of its imperial associations, Atatürk took as his official residence in Istanbul.
You were very close to his bedroom.
Yeah, evet.
Did you used to play in between here?
Ataturk wanted me close to him, so he gave me this room, which used to be the Sultan's study. I used to ride my little toy car from my room to his bedroom. Sometimes I broke a few things in the palace. People would complain, but Ataturk overlooked it. He was very kind to children and understood their psychology well.
The last days of the Ottoman Empire had been played out at the Dolmabahce Palace, and it was also to witness the end of another era. For it was here in this bed that Ataturk died on November the 10th, 1938. He was a national hero. He had created a peaceful, strong and modern state out of the ashes of an autocratic and outdated empire. Each year, mourners flock here on the anniversary of his death, their tears a sign of the reverence in which he is still held by the Turks. Ülkü has turned her Istanbul apartment into something of a shrine to her adopted father and the brief years they spent together. In her view, Turkey's commitment to his secular principles has waned in the years since his death.
No, I don't think he would be happy if he was alive today. Turkey has deteriorated a lot since he died. They closed down many of the educational institutions he established and started opening religious schools, which are necessary, but not in these amounts.
Atatürk's legacy is full of paradoxes. In the years following his death, an ideology grew up around his principles. The ideology took one of Atatürk's names. It was called Kemalism. It was an ideology which enshrined secularism over religion. Adherents today claim it is under threat. Since Atatürk's death in 1938, Kemalism, at the heart of which is the principle of secularism, has become the dominant ideology of the Turkish state. But there is an increasing feeling in some quarters that this Kemalist status quo is coming under threat. In reaction to this threat against Atatürk's secular legacy, Turkish nationalism is on the rise.
There are other icons that are being put up in Turkey, like over there you'll see this huge Turkish flag that's gone up recently. You see them all over the country now, and which is a symbol of a more aggressive nationalism.
The real fundamentalism in this country, the really serious fundamentalism, the really dangerous fundamentalism, is the nationalist fundamentalism. And it has been in power for 80 years, and its rule has not been uniformly good for this country.
Nationalist symbols are everywhere in Turkey. National flags and pictures of Atatürk. Perhaps this is a reaction to a perceived threat, the threat of the very thing Atatürk strove to remove from political life: religion. The AK party has been in power in Turkey since 2001. It draws its support from the marginalized of Turkish society, many of whom maintain a traditional Islamic way of life. The ruling party dismisses the idea that it is seeking to overturn the secular system, and it accuses those who say it wants to introduce Islam into political life of scaremongering. Yet earlier this year, the political system fell into turmoil after the opposition refused to accept the AK nomination for President Abdullah Gül, claiming the secularist system would be endangered if both President and Prime Minister were members of the AK party. It is in the context of this contest that Atatürk's memory is being revived.
Atatürk's image is everywhere in Turkey, and it's big business. This factory just outside of Istanbul produces thousands of statues and busts of the national hero every year. And with the elections approaching, demand has never been higher.
The The owner of the factory explained to me that the statues are commissioned by government officers, schools and individuals. But why are Turks putting their leader on such open display decades after his death? To find out, I visited a branch of the Atatürk Thought Association. The very name had a slightly sinister ring to it, and as I entered, it seemed that I wasn't alone. Atatürk's image was all over, and unnervingly, his eyes were watching me.
We established the Atatürk Thought Association in 1989. At that time, society was being purposefully and systematically distanced from Kemalist thought. We wanted to stop this perversion and make sure society remained under Kemalist ideology. We educate young people in an attempt to spread Kemalist thought. Atatürk's thoughts cannot be kept alive by ceremony and gestures, nor can he be protected by laws. You protect him by spreading his ideas and keeping them alive.
Şener Eruygur was involved in organizing the recent protest against Gül's presidential nomination. So too was Bedri Baykam. He is one of Turkey's foremost contemporary artists. People often associated with a love of the new and irreverence towards past heroes. But not Mr. Baykam. He uses Atatürk's image in his art for unapologetically political ends.
This country in the last 20 years probably has done nothing but criticizing Atatürk. But when we look to the country overall, the more he's attacked or the more his legacy becomes hot politics for today's Turkey, the love for his image grows. You have more and more people wearing pins of Atatürk or having Atatürk's portrait put in their house, or the way they put the Turkish flag out in important national days. Believe me, a key word, you have to be Turkish to understand why his image is there, why it's not just there to veneer as a Buddha, and why this love and respect for his image is so constantly present without being a threat to free thinking or democracy of a free person.
But not all of Turkey's 70 million people are Turks. Some 15 million, or 20% of the population, are Kurds. The Kurds were promised an independent homeland at the Treaty of Sèvres. But this dream was quashed following the creation of the Turkish Republic. Groups such as the PKK have continued the struggle for self-rule, leading to over 30,000 deaths in the past 25 years. Many Kurds have a less than enthusiastic opinion of Kemalism. Tarık Ziya Ekinci has devoted his life to studying Turkey's Kurds.
Atatürk treated Kurds and Turks as equals. He recognized the rights of the Kurds. But the Turkish nationalism, which was imposed on Turkey after the 1950s, changed all that. Today, in the Constitution, there is a clause that every citizen of this country must identify himself as Turkish. You are a traitor to this country if you do not call yourself a Turk. Turkishness was forced on the Kurds by the military-civil establishment, which sees itself as being above the law.
Atatürk was feted for his skill and bravery as a soldier, and the military continues to hold him in the highest esteem. It considers itself a champion of Atatürk and Kemalism. To this day, Atatürk's place of rest, this mausoleum in Ankara, is guarded by the military, and it is army officers who lead the tributes on the anniversary of his death. On a number of occasions since Atatürk's death, the military has mounted coups. They have never remained in direct power, but neither have they tolerated a political outcome that would threaten the Kemalist status quo. General Oktar Ataman was in the Turkish military for 43 years and recently retired from a senior role. Mr. Ataman defended the military's intervention in Turkey's political system with an unusual but revealing metaphor, and one which may serve as a warning to the ruling AK party not to overstep the mark.
When my son was a small child, I bought him a model train set. but he had difficulty in providing the right speed for the train. The train oversped and derailed. I put it back on the tracks for him, and he went on playing with it. Perhaps that describes the military's situation in Turkey. The military likes to do its own job and not meddle in politics. But every now and then there comes a stage when the military is forced to intervene and put the train back on its democratic tracks. Those interferences only take place when the Turkish constitution is endangered, especially the first articles such as secularity, democracy, law and order.
It is Turkish intellectuals who are most critical of the state's paternalistic role. They feel it is becoming less tolerant of dissent. State laws have been introduced banning criticism of Atatürk and Turkishness, and there have been high-profile attempts to prosecute figures such as Nobel Prize-winning author Orhan Pamuk. Ragıp Zarakolu is a publisher who has himself been prosecuted under such laws.
I can define Turkey, it is the last totalitarian state in Europe. Before there were several books published which criticized Atatürk policy, Kemalism, and there was no problem.
Another intellectual who is concerned about the state's attitude to criticism of Atatürk and his legacy is Sevan Nişanyan. In the current political climate, he won't risk publication of his latest book, preferring to distribute it privately.
I've written a book about the founding of the Republic, and it's a book of a series of questions about what Kemal Atatürk means and what his legacy is. For this country, it is considered a rather radical questioning. I mean, you don't question great idols. These things are risky in Turkey. You know, you don't discuss Atatürk openly in Turkey. A lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of people, including a lot of judges and a lot of soldiers too, consider this a very serious attack on national honor.
The law prohibiting criticism of Atatürk was passed after his death. However, in his time, he accepted criticism. For example, an English writer wrote a book about him, claiming that he liked to drink a lot and lived a life of leisure and pleasure. Those around Atatürk banned the book, but when Atatürk read it, he said, "Why did you ban it? It actually understates my fondness for drink, rather than exaggerating it."
Atatürk died 7 decades ago, but his legacy, expressed through the idea of secularism, is still very much alive in the Turkey of today. He is indispensable to all sides of the political debate.
But that, say some, is the very problem.
Turkey has to move on from expecting that Kemal Atatürk has an answer for everything. He should be seen more as a historic figure than someone who can be brought back to life at every occasion.
The straitjacket that Turkey has been imprisoned in is not holding anymore. It's just breaking at every seam.
There are signs that the status quo which Atatürk has been used to maintain in Turkey, in which the army wields significant power, minorities are oppressed, freedom of speech seriously curtailed, and Islam kept out of politics, may not hold forever. Atatürk is the unquestioned national hero, the man who drove out occupiers and created the Republic of Turkey. His achievements are clear. It is now for Turks to decide if he is to be remembered as a benign father or an overbearing big brother.